access. Let's move on to that, because we've all mentioned it, I think, in what we've said here, that access is a hot topic at the moment. Sorry. Particularly with regard to innovation. So I'd like to look at some of the successes today and how we can address some of the questions around that. Matthew, how has the UK invested to ensure that gene therapies are being made available to eligible rare disease patients, and how has the UK facilitated that sort of success? Can you talk to us a little bit about that landscape?
I can. It's actually, I'm going to canter through it, but actually there's an enormous amount of investment that has gone in to enable access to gene therapies and cell therapies for patients. And it goes right back to 20 or 30 years worth of scientific research. And then if you work forwards from there, the UKRI and the MRC have been funding clinical trial work, also through the NIHR. You've got investment through organizations like our own and others in manufacturing capability. You've got LifeArc, the charity, investing alongside the MRC in new manufacturing processes. And you may be asking, why is this relevant? This is relevant because some of the access questions that crop up are simply a question of economics, in that today it is difficult in some circumstances, to manufacture the product in the volumes that are being demanded at a cost point that enables a transaction to take place. And so a huge amount of investment is going into enabling lower cost manufacturing of therapeutics. But then you go onwards, the Advanced Therapy Treatment Centers was an initiative set up several years ago to learn about what it takes in the hospital system to bring a cell or a gene therapy through to patient use. And it revealed things like protocols, about patient pathways, about training, all starting to develop the infrastructure at a time ahead of actually when the therapeutics came through. Not massive amounts of infrastructure, but learning how the infrastructure needed to be and putting in places the mechanisms to keep learning, because we're all on a journey here and we need to keep that going. I think whilst I'm talking about the infrastructure, those have been great successes. And I think the fact that there are gene therapies that are being used and are being paid for today is testament to years worth of work in preparation. It's clearly not the end of the story, and there's more investment that needs to come down the road. I'd like to point out, because it's relevant to the access question, an area of investment which is always a difficult one for people to get their heads around, and that is around the investment in adoption, the investment in uptake, because it's a very important concept, and it's an unowned from the perspective of the healthcare system. So the healthcare providers are interested in providing good economic healthcare. The innovators are interested in developing new therapeutics. If we are going to have widespread adoption of gene therapies, we need to bring down the cost. One of the keys to bringing down the cost is increasing the volumes. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. You need to get those volumes up in order to bring down the cost in the long term. And somebody needs to come forward and say, right, we're going to make this happen. We're going to bring in the infrastructure, bring in the adoption, and bring in the patient benefits in order to create that flow that brings down the long-term cost.
Matthew, I see you were nodding quite a lot there. Sheila, did you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good summary of all of the activities. And I think, if I were to list some things that I think the UK has done in order to kind of support gene therapies coming through is, things like policies and frameworks that have been put into place by, for example, NICE and NHS England, and the MHRA, who are now kind of adopting licensing arrangements from the US and other kind of agencies. So in some respects, trying to expedite the kind of timeline for approvals. NICE have, to my knowledge, and I may be slightly factually inaccurate, but most gene therapies have been given a positive appraisal at NICE, therefore been given access, bar one, as far as I remember, if my stats are correct. And the NHS infrastructure, the NHS is taking huge steps to try and ensure that their service provision, their training, and working with organisations like the Catapult, LifeArc and others is ready to receive these. And I think, you know, Matthew's made a really important point about actually, you know, being able to manufacture these things in a much more effective and efficient way is going to be much more beneficial for the system in order to support that adoption. And I think LifeArc, if I saw only yesterday or the day before, recently introduced a RED, the Translational Research Fund. So, you know, being able to support the system to be able to translate the science into the clinic is a really important step. So I think, you know, in that regard, I think UK is really trying really hard to ensure all of the appropriate mechanisms are in place to encourage innovation and to adopt innovation. But I'm with Matthew. I think there is a real need to ensure that more support is given to the adoption side of things, because, you know, working with the NHS in my previous role, it was really hard because, I'll just take a really small example. You've got 5 gene therapies that all have different, you know, different mechanisms of delivery or different ways of storing some of the compounds and stuff. And that in itself can be a real challenge. You know, how many fridges does one hospital have to accommodate for all of these different genes? It's a really stupid thing to think about, but actually, from a practical perspective, it's a total nightmare.
Absolutely. So we've had a lot of obviously good high profile successes, I guess, in, you know, in the leukodystrophies and MLD and in SMA. Sam, you know, are you seeing firsthand through your work with patients the impact that that's having? You know, are you hearing about the benefits and challenges of those treatments?
Not specifically on those treatments. It's very interesting because when you run a helpline, people contact you when they're in trouble, not when they're having a good day. So we get to hear the bad stuff rather than the good things. Through our network, our partnership network of different condition-specific support groups, we are hearing stories, not specifically around those conditions, but where other conditions have had cell therapies that have actually modified the course of the disease. And that's a really interesting position to be in, because again, going back to that concept of the early adopter, those families that have taken those treatments and are on those treatments are, you know, that their loved ones are having a modified course of their disease. So to put it bluntly, in some cases, they shouldn't be here with us any longer. They should have passed away, and the rule book has gone. So then you say, okay, we're on this treatment, we don't know what happens next. And that's exciting and positive and wonderful, because the therapy has done what it's meant to do and modified the course of the disease, but then no one knows what's going to happen. And so it creates a slight anxiety, but it's a positive anxiety, if that makes sense.
New territory, isn't it?
Yes, it is that. We're going into a voyage of the unknown and we're not exactly sure what's happening. And I can see that being replicated for many families as gene therapies come along, because it is unknown, but it is exciting.
And that can bring its own challenges, can't it? You know, in terms of, for example, careers, future planning, if you weren't expected to have that life ahead, or, you know, suddenly you might have to be thinking about things that you might not have been thinking about before, like, you know, in pensions, going to work, education that may not have been a priority before. So, you know, it brings a whole load of new things that need education and awareness and planning and things. So absolutely. And Matthew, if we can come back to you in terms of these therapies, you know, is there enough capacity in the NHS for these to be made available? You touched on this a little bit, but, you know, how widely are they being used currently, and what needs to be done, I guess, to build that capacity to meet what we hope to see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of inflaming debate, the mismatch that today is not as pronounced as the mismatch might be in the future if all the promises are realised. At the moment, the level of usage is in the early adopter phase, as I think Sam was saying earlier on. And the system is putting enormous amounts of resource into making sure that these therapeutics are being developed in a safe and consistent way. It's what comes next is, I think, the question that needs to be addressed in good time. I was privileged to be part of the experience of the rollout of another form of cell therapy, arguably gene therapy as well, but CAR-Ts in the UK. And the health system actually started to work on that at the right time and at great pace in order to enable adoption. And I think we know that the system can do it. They've got to choose the time to do it. But from where we are today, we're talking about tens of therapeutics being used, in maybe hundreds if you add it, depending where you put the boundaries. The future, when you're talking about 3.5 million patients in rare disease, for whom the therapeutics have not been developed today, but as we get more experience, more therapeutics will be developed and become onto the market. Then you're talking about thousands, and then you're talking about tens of thousands, and then potentially you're talking about hundreds of thousands. And if you look at the infrastructure that we have for these kinds of are highly specialized treatments, we don't have the infrastructure in place to do that today in the way that we do it today. I'd like to come back to a point that was made earlier on about when you've got 4 or 5 different gene therapies coming through the system, and they've all got different ways of operating, that adds enormous burden to the resources that we have in the hospital system. So one of the things that collectively we all need to do as an industry, as a healthcare industry, as a government, as a patient community, is to demand convergence of technologies and standardization. We are talking about a new technology cycle, a new introduction of new technologies, and we see that in every other industry. When there is convergence of technology, there is a convergence of standards, the ability to use those, think of your mobile phone, okay? Just think about what happened when mobile phones went to GSM and now everybody has one and can't leave house without it. That's the kind of scale of change that could take place if we start to talk about standards. We start talking about hospital standards, manufacturing standards, therapeutic standards, labeling standards, whatever it might be, and bring everybody together. And then we still need to grow the infrastructure in the UK, but we don't need to grow it. We might need to grow it at perhaps 1/10 the rate compared to the way that we're using it today.
Fantastic, thank you. You mentioned, and actually we've got some really great questions that have been submitted by participants that cover that, so I'd like to make sure we've got time to come to those at the end. But you mentioned, Sheila, about NICE. Now, how easy is it for NICE to evaluate data on these types of innovations? Is it a new way of thinking and a new process for them?
Oh, I'd use the word easy. So I think, in rare diseases, nothing is easy. And I wish it was, because we probably wouldn't be having some of these conversations. But I think that the kind of way I might rephrase it a little bit is does the NICE approach enable gene therapies to be approved? And I suppose in general, my answer is yes, because most gene therapies that have gone through the NICE process have had a positive outcome. But I think the things that need to be aligned or in the right place for that to happen are that good evidence generation, which is clearly a challenge for gene therapies from a number of perspectives. One, around the number of patients that are originally treated in the trial. Secondly, the long-term outcomes and the potential adverse risks. And as I think some members of the panel have talked about, what are the kind of long-term implications of changing the course of the disease? That's kind of the unknown and the bit that we feel most nervous about, I think. And then, the kind of elephant in the room often, because of the challenges that we've described, and definitely the ones that Matthew's described, the price, how do we make sure that the system can afford these things? So all of those things, if they are aligned and they work well and there's huge collaboration with all of the relevant stakeholders, then I think there's a real opportunity for gene therapies to be given a positive kind of reception, if you will, at NICE. But it does require, from my experience, having kind of run the highly specialized technology program, a huge amount of effort and engagement from all of those stakeholders to make sure that those decisions that are being made are made in the right way, with the right information in front of them and with the right considerations taken into account of.
Yeah, I think that leads us on really nicely. I mean, we know that evaluating and reimbursement in rare disease is a challenging environment. So it'd be good to unpick that a little